or if we prefer, I'll go to him, Planner Glasgow to have the discussion.
Why don't we start with why it was brought up?
That would be helpful.
I don't know, my recollection was we just had a discussion. You had raised the question of whether we could change the amount of the tax and whether it was a tax or fee or not. And I think
Right.
I said something about it's a tax under the way it was passed, and I think it would take a Tabor vote to change it, and I don't recall. I mean, there are some specifics, kind of questions about how it's applied, but I wasn't really, that was really just a back and forth discussion, kind of whether it could be raised, and if so, how, and whether it was a tax or a fee, and I think most of that's been answered.
But there's another side to it, I think, which is the STR portion, which a couple of questions have come up in terms of examples, like properties that have two residences that are each individually owned as primary residents on the same property.
Oh, yeah, but I know that, I know what that has to do with lodging tax, I mean,
Well, the
Unless-
question, yeah, the question is, can they both be STRs?
yeah.
And if so, then, that's two. And so you have that, on one hand, if you have a lot of STRs, you get more tax revenue, you have, more places for people to stay. But on the other hand, do we really want there to be, like in one case, there are two properties side by side that are each in one plot, but they each have two individually owned dwellings on it. And so, are there some policy implications there that we need to either send back to PCDC or, give some guidance related to?
So this has been in effect a year, because it went into effect in June, right, of 2018. So we have
That's right, yeah.
roughly a year's experience with it. Can you just speak to how you think it's going?
Sure, yeah, the STR?
Mhm.
STRs are almost fully licensed. We have one outstanding license, and we've issued fines on that one. The owner lives out of town and has never applied for a license and is renting. And so I think we're up to a substantial fine on that one, and we're trying to consider our next steps, whether it's a summons or what. We're not sure where we're going with that. I think I heard about the case where there are two individual homes on a R1 lot. That happened through condominiumization. So I think it happened through a state process which we do not or haven't instituted control over. They broke off and created an HOA for a R1 lot with two homes, and thereby provided ownership of those individual units, and those are primary homes. So they would then fall under when we look through the STR, they are allowed to do it in R1, and they're allowed to do it if it's their primary home. So those two homes would be allowed to have an STR. I haven't seen another one of those yet, but
I think there are two, like, right next door to each other.
They haven't been condominiumized yet.
they haven't been.
417 and 423.
There is, the town may adopt controls over condominiumization.
But we can't outlaw it.
We can't outlaw it. It's kind of like the subdivision process. You can control it. But that's as much as I know. Brandon would know a lot more.
Yeah, there's a state statute that controls condominiumization, and basically what it says is that no municipality can enact a law which prohibits or otherwise impedes condominiumization, but we can place limits on how it's done. Basically, that we control the process. So in Littleton, for example, require the documents for the HOA be sent to us. We could review them. But we can't really say that these aren't good enough, but so long as they meet the requirements under state law. But there are some things you can do. But right now, there's nothing in Lions Code which controls this process. And pursuant to state law, they're allowed to do it so long as they file the necessary documents with the county. So that's kind of how that happened.
Are those being used as STRs currently? Or are people living full-time?
One of them is an STR that we know of, yes.
Yes.
The other one is not, as of yet, hasn't applied for an STR license.
So just a little more background. When we did this fee, we had a lot of discussion about whether it could be a tax or a fee. And our advice at the time, we looked at statutory towns and we looked at home rule towns. And for statutory towns, there was a mix of those who used a percentage versus a flat fee. And what it came down to is that there had been a challenge of someone who did it as a percentage and they lost because it wasn't, they were a statutory town. So it came down to how strongly did we feel like we had risk of it being challenged. And there were some entities who were impacted by this who were not happy with what we did. And so we took the route of going as a flat fee. And because it also applied to camping, we looked at comps for, how would that impact our camping rates? And would that push us out of being competitive for camping rates to include camping? But there's more camping than there is STR. So to leave camping out would have ended up with such a small amount of money. Is it really worth our time? The other thing is the flat fees were between $2 and $4 in the other communities that we looked at. So this is how we arrived at where we are, for the background.
We are receiving lodging reports from most lodgers. Our projected revenue is still behind what's actual at this point, but we don't have August numbers in, nor September, and so we think we'll catch up in those numbers.
So of the licensed STRs, most of them, or almost all of them, are filing lodging tax reports?
Most of them are filing, yes.
And they're still
occasionally, people don't think they have to file when they don't rent, but you have to file every month.
So they're still not able to get it collected through Airbnb?
I think that's right. The sales tax is collected through
Right.
Airbnb,
They can't
but
get Airbnb to collect the lodging tax, huh?
we need to negotiate that with them, is my understanding.
We have to negotiate with Airbnb company. It's not the homeowners that have established.
I think it's us, is what they've asked before.
The attorney.
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds like based on the last correspondence we had, then I'd have to talk to them, and we've not followed up on that yet. But I can do that. I actually made a note of that when we were talking about this. I can do that.
But pretty much everybody's self-reporting on that.
As far as we know, there are a few outstanding ones, but,
You said there's one lodger that is not reported to date?
well, there's one lodger that has not filed a STR license. And we've asked them to cease until they do. That's a person that lives out of town. And we've been finding them. And our next step is probably a summons.
You can also put a tax lien on the property.
We could do that. There are several things that we can do.
The code specifically provides for that remedy.
Right.
If they're non-resident, how could they qualify?
We believe that it may be a family member, and we did make that provision, so they could.
I requested that we discuss lodging tax increase during the discussion before adding use of for short-term rental in commercial zones for a couple of reasons. One, because we saw that the revenue wasn't meeting projected or budgeted. And two, I think because there's some perception that we're not seeing the ratio of lodging tax per camper that we might have expected. So there was some discussion about whether we even have the ability to raise the rate because it was a ballot question. And staff was going to make that determination for us before we really have, there's no point in discussing if we can't do it, right?
Well, one thing just to clarify, because it's not per camper, it's per campsite. And so they had to do
Right,
an estimate of how
right.
many campers they think there are per site. And that was something that, I don't know the outcome of that, but you guys were going to talk to them about that as part of the negotiation and how they were going to do that. So do we get a,
Well, for this year, they counted 6 campers per campsite. And so if that's not something that the board is comfortable with, that should be something we can negotiate in the lease for next year.
so we can address it that way through the lease if we feel like our estimates were off. But I think also the estimates were rough because we really didn't know at the time how many of these there would be, how it would impact camping and how the camping would translate. I mean, it would take a ballot question to do this, so the next opportunity to do that would be in April. Not sure how, we would have to explain why we're asking again 1 year, 2 years in, I guess.
Just went into effect January 1st of this year.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Do we have the authority, or that going back to the voters, to amend the ordinance, the implementing ordinance for that and define campsite in a particular way based on some criteria we could come up with? Right now, it just says campsite's like a place to camp or something like that. But we could perhaps by definition amendment
So long as it didn't.
address the issue of.
So long as it didn't
calculating
result in an increase of the tax.
It wouldn't be $2 per campsite like it is now, but what a campsite is the real question.
an easier way to do that without paying to go through the ordinance process would be to measure our campsites over there and do it by dimension and measure the square footage and say, if you're using this much area for camping, we're gonna, we could potentially do something along those lines to negotiate with them how they need to define it. And say, we're estimating there are X amount of campsites here, not based on the number of campers, but based on square footage that they're using for camping. Because tents are fairly uniform. I mean, even if you went with the largest one,
There's small ones as well.
there's various sizes. You could take an average and come up with a decent number to validate what they're saying, and see how off it is. You could expect a plus or minus X percentage, based on tent size, I guess. I don't know. I just think there's
Yeah.
maybe other ways we could go at it that we wouldn't have to,
You could do a physical count during a festival
Yeah, we can do
and come up with a reasonable
a
estimate.
sample.
Yeah, pick an area and, yeah.
We know how big the park is, so.
Yeah, I think the other challenge to that is number of nights. So it's also $2 per night. And so, from talking to the Planet with Camping, they did file and pay the occupancy fee. But how do you get the number of nights? Because people come and go different nights, and so maybe on one night there's more versus others. But
Except that the taxes in terms of, it's a tax on the occupation of providing lodging. So if they've sold a campsite and somebody doesn't show up, they still own the tax. They've provided the site. Lodging
Yeah,
includes
the
campsites.
money's been paid.
And very, they sell, they don't really do per night, so they sell camping passes for the whole duration of the festival. So they've collected money for the use of that campsite, whether some campers go spend Saturday night in Boulder or not. So, yeah.
I think it just comes down to, do we want to spend money and time on this? For how much extra money are we talking here?
And to your
That's-
point, I called the town of Eagle, Colorado, which is the town that our previous attorneys used as kind of a model for the lodging fee, because it held up in the state court that at the fee it was okay, and they charged $4 per night. I talked to
tax.
their finance director and said, how do you enforce this? And they said, it's such for them, low-hanging fruit for the town of Eagle, that they just, I think if hotels pay it, that's great. And they do have a few more hotels, but they use it from a short-term vacation rentals. And the other thing too is, the Aspen leave has pretty much been closed all summer. And again, I'm not sure their model of how they operate is short-term or longer-term, so we haven't, that was in part of the projections, but they're not open currently.
I'm kind of curious if we think about this also from the perspective, since it's only, well, it hasn't even been a year yet, really. Maybe our expectation of what we put down as a budget really was off. I mean, so we don't know that yet, so I'm a little hesitant to go change something until we've once seen a full year and then kind of evaluate, were we so far off the mark out of expectation and we need to reevaluate?
Well,
what's
remember when you
happening?
do a Tabor vote, you go high because you don't want to have to give money back.
Right.
And so we always estimate higher than we think we're actually going to come in. Because
Okay.
if you come in lower than what you pass in your ballot measure in your first year, then you have to refund the money, and it's a mess. So almost always that first year, you're likely to come in under budget. In fact, when we passed the marijuana tax the first time, we underestimated it, came really close to having to do refunds. And where do you even begin to refund?
Right.
So
Who do
do
you
you-
give money to and how much? And
So you go back to
Yeah.
the ballot and ask to keep it, essentially, which doesn't always happen.
And I think the city of Boulder just had to do that in the last election with the sugar tax. on
yes, they
soda.
did. And then they couldn't figure out who they're going to get it. Does it go to the distributor? Does it get back to the vendor?
I
Yeah.
have no idea.
Yeah, so.
Just-
So, but then, once you get through that first year, then you can sort of figure out and be.
Then you can budget
realistic.
what's real, because your first year is kind of collecting a baseline. All you want to make sure is that your baseline doesn't come in over your Tabor ballot language.
Just a footnote is that we talked about, and I think it may have even been an assumption early on that the town's campsites would be subject, but then
That's
talked
true.
about, well, we don't,
Yeah.
towns don't pay tax.
Right.
Or, but this is a fee, and so, but then we said, well, the town's able to raise or lower their camping fee just as a direct fee. And so that seemed to be a more rational way of handling that, so that the town campsites are not subject to this.
I just- One more thing I'd throw out on this, before we'd ever go back to the voters for changing the amount of this tax, the lodging tax, I think if you're going to go to the voters, you ought to give more consideration to going to the voters to approve an occupation tax on amusements, including large events. Some home rule cities, it sometimes takes the form of an admissions tax per ticket. Statutory towns can't do that, but they do have the ability to do an occupation tax on providing amusements, and you could graduate it between small and large events. And if you ever go back to the voters for something like this, I think that's what ought to be focused on.
We talked about that, and the reason we didn't go that route is, one, they have a lot of volunteers that run it, and it really is tied to employees that work there.
Doesn't have to be.
Well, that's how most of them are done, is based on, because what they are trying to do is offset impacts from a large number of employees coming in and commuting to a really large business that happens to be located in your community, but the people don't live there to pay property tax, might be generating some sales tax, but that was generally how that's used, is my understanding.
Denver does
So-
it that way, but you don't have to, small towns don't have to do it that way. There's a
Well-
lot of ways you could do it.
We didn't feel like there was going to be enough money, and I think we do have to be cautious of how often we go to the voters, because I
I know.
think their perception is every time they pass something that's big and you asking for a lot of money, whether you are or aren't, and they don't pass
No.
very many
And I'm not
things. So
suggesting,
it could hurt your chances when you really need a sales tax increase or a mill levy increase.
and I'm not suggesting we do that
So,
anytime soon. I'm just saying
yeah.
if thought in the future is given toward to going back to the voters on something relating to a lodging tax or some other kind of occupation tax, that's the one I'd focus on, because I think you can more easily administer that. Because it's really, you can make the taxes narrow or broad as you want to. You could exempt events under 500 people. You could exempt school events, charitable events, government events, and it would only apply to a few events in town. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I
And
think
it's
this is
not a tax on
statutory.
employees, it's not a tax
Yeah.
on sale of tickets to people. It would be a tax on the occupation of providing amusements in the town of Lyons.
It's not an issue I've researched, as I know is coming, so I can't speak to as to how or we would implement such a tax at this time.
Anyway, I'm just saying, I think that'd be a more productive use of effort if we ever got to that than changing the lodging tax rate. Anyway.
Okay. Anything else on this one?
So, do we want to refer the policy question about multiple primary dwellings to BCDC just to look at or prioritize it, however it's prioritized?
The condominium of two single-family homes on a single R1 lot, I think when we talk about what an ADU is, not Town of Lyons ADU policy, but just what's understood to be an accessory dwelling unit and what was discussed when we developed ADU policy for bringing existing ADUs into some form of compliance. We understood that a second house on a R1 property is an ADU. And I asked staff and trustees and planning commissioners a few times when these policies were evolving, are we sure that we're not going to have short-term rentals in an ADU? And universally, it was like, that will not happen. It cannot happen. And yet, it has happened. And so, one, I think that this is obviously, but it sort of crosses the spirit or the intent of creating ADUs and short-term rental policies in the first place. But two, what does it say about, can each one of these homes then build an ADU? Can another home with an ADU then be condominiumized? And in each case, each is eligible to be a short-term rental. And then from there, what does that say about our utilities connections and water shares requirements?
Taps and meters too, so you know it's on the budget.
I think I can address, on an R1 lot, you wouldn't be able to add a second home. These are pre-existing conditions, so these homes were probably built prior to that code. So you wouldn't be able to add another home onto a different R1 lot. There are a few lots like this in town.
But how do you know that, I mean, what says that an ADU can't be just condominiumized to a second home?
Because you can't, in the ADU code, it wouldn't be allowed.
But you said the state controls this, not us, right?
The condominiumization.
But I mean, the reason why they're able to be condominiumized, they are truly two separate single-family homes. If it was an ADU, it wouldn't have all the necessary connections in order to be a separate ownership unit. I mean, the problem we have with these particular units is that they're truly two single-family homes placed on one lot, which would not be permissible in the current code. They violate every setback there is. You couldn't build a new one of these if you wanted to. There's an artifact of the town's history, essentially. In an ideal world, they'd be on separate lots, but
Yeah.
that's kind of the problem. We're stuck with a couple of these where they're truly two single-family homes of separate ownership on one lot, which typically would not be permissible.
But how many cases do we have in town that?
Not many, I don't think, but it's a handful.
I wouldn't be able to tell you. I know of at least two others. I think one R1 lot has three on it, 3 homes. It's still under one ownership, but The problem with that is, they theoretically, if that, currently our code says, if there's a fire, you could rebuild that. If there's a flood, you could rebuild that home, the second and the third home on that lot. It's a non-conforming home, and you can maintain that home over time, do ordinary maintenance. But typically, you can't do anything more than that. You can't add to it. Yeah. Sorry about this.
So if one of the lots that has two buildings on it now has already been condominiumized, could they, for example, build another unit without changing the footprint of the houses? Another unit above, for example, second floor, third floor?
They can't do additions onto the house. It can be maintained, but they can't do additions.
So they can't.
They change
create
the.
another- What if they have an attic already?
They could.
I just make that another unit. All I'm trying to do is,
Sure.
are there policy questions here that need to be looked at?
I'll have to think about it. You can add an ADU to a single-family home. But this lot is already non-conforming. So I'm not sure how that would work.
So being a non-conforming home, they can't pull a permit to do anything major, otherwise they're gonna trigger things we're discussing here that can't be done.
Necessary compliance with the current code.
Yeah, setbacks and everything. They're not gonna change their
Right.
ability to have two single-family living units on this lot.
I didn't hear the question.
Would they have, if they file a permit, they really can't do anything, as you're saying, so. But you mentioned before you started, you said if there's a fire, they can rebuild.
Correct.
Flood. Is
A
there
flood.
anything we can do to change that in our?
It's in the code. We could change the code.
Change that, the non-conforming lots, that if one of those places burns down, destroyed by winds, tree, whatever, it has to come up to current, we can make it something that has to come up to current standards or what we're using for everyone else, so it's.
Yeah, the one.
It's one of those things that would maybe take care of itself in 20, 30, 40 years, but
I think that, I like that idea and that approach. I really want the PCDC to finish downtown design standards and some of the other bigger things. I worry about trying to go and regulate for low frequency events.
It
There's
just
gonna
makes
be a
it so
handful of
future.
these.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound to me like they're completely out of character with what a lot of the other non-conforming things that we find in some of the old town neighborhoods. It sounds like it's kind of a creative way to solve, it's creating housing, I mean.
Or creating short-term rental.
Well, I think I'd be open to trying to make sure it's not short-term rental, but condominium isn't a horrible thing. I mean, I think it's a creative way for people to add more housing, as long as it conforms to code. I mean, I think that's the safety aspects, I think, are worth discussing and making sure that they're not building unsafe units.
So just to address the point about short-term rentals, both of those homes need to be a primary resident. The short-term rental has to be a primary residence, so somebody has to live there 6 to 9 months in order for it to be a STR as
They're
well.
already out of compliance there.
No, because somebody is living there
No, in each unit?
in each unit. They're-
There's a permanent resident in each unit.
That's
Oh, I
our
thought you
understanding.
said there was one and one not.
No, you can't do that under our code. So each of those has a primary residence in it, but one of them has an STR license to rent.
It does, okay. But it's actually acting like a single-family residence,
Correct.
really.
It is,
Correct.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many of those there could possibly be. Is that really worth?
There's only a handful of them. You can't build a new one because it would violate setbacks. I mean, these are just kind of, as I said, an artifact of the history of the town where back when these things were not enforced, a handful of these lots had multiple primary residences built on them, which you could not do today. It'd violate the setbacks and other aspects of the code as well, but.
Trustee Miller had a comment. Sorry, I
he
think
just
you-
answered it,
Yeah.
actually, yeah.
Okay.
If somebody came in to pull an ADU on a lot with 2 homes, I would say that isn't consistent with the code in my interpretation.
So they can only have one in one of the units, because is it to the lot or to the residence?
It's to the lot. Now, if they did it internally, I'd have to look into that. If they did it, if they tried to do a conditional use, that I would say no
That
to.
wouldn't be allowed.
Right.
I'd like to understand how you're confident that a house with an ADU couldn't be condominiumized to become. I don't follow why there's a distinction.
I mean, I can't give you all the exact answers right now, but I mean, the biggest problem is if you're kind of minimizing it, you need to split it up and sell it to 2 private owners. You're selling an ADU, which may not have the full suite of utilities. It may have a kitchen. It may not be it'd have to need its own certificate of occupancy, which we wouldn't grant. It'd be worthless property.
An ADU is a separate single-family home.
Doesn't have to be separate, could be upstairs.
Could be upstairs.
Yeah, but I mean, a detached ADU,
Detached.
yes, is a separate single-family home.
Typically, an ADU, is my understanding, doesn't have the full suite of. I mean, it has like. It does,
Yes, they do.
Accessory,
That's exactly what the definition of
It's a
an
small
ADU
house.
is. Is a full kitchen, full bath, I mean, it is another single family home, that's the definition. That's the definition between an STR
mm.
and an ADU,
Is the kitchen.
is the kitchen.
But isn't it the case in our code that you couldn't, that they share utilities though?
Do
Yeah.
what, two
They're-
The
utilities?
ADU,
Utilities.
yeah, they share utilities.
Yeah, and that's a
They
big
switch
distinction.
It's a big
the
distinction.
water.
Yeah.
So that if somebody wanted to convert an ADU, condominiumize and convert it to a primary.
They had to put in
then
the
they would have
utilities.
to get a water tap, a sewer tap,
Correct.
a water share.
So these
But I'm
two.
sure some.
These have separate utilities.
I'm
That's
sure,
like $100,000.
but I'm sure there are some lots in town that have another water tap on them.
Sure, it's a mix.
Right, I mean, I know that for a fact
Sure.
that there are.
Mhm, right.
You know, so they could obviously do that.
So-
They could build a whole nother house on the property as an ADU, and then condominiumize it, just like what's being said.
I don't,
In what I'm,
But wouldn't that
information
ADU,
that I'm getting,
wouldn't the ADU violate the setbacks? So, I mean, probably, I
well, it
mean,
doesn't have to, but I think you have to own both in order for it to be an ADU. I think there's an ownership
is it.
requirement.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so you can't have an ADU without having both.
But then if you
Well,
condominiumize, then you
afterwards.
sell it and it
After.
becomes something
I
else.
mean, it's,
That would violate it. There would be a zoning infraction. There'd be a non-conforming.
That we don't have control over,
Well, we can.
but we don't, right, currently.
that's,
Currently, we don't have any regulations on condominiumization. I mean, we need those in the future. That's something we need to work on.
Our code says it has to be owner occupied.
But I think the situation they're talking about is like you build the ADU, that's permitted.
No, I get it.
And then
Yeah.
they
And then they
condo
come
it, and
to
they sell a lot,
Yeah,
the,
which is,
because our code is mom on the 2-family houses being, our code does say it's supposed to be the owner
I think
of the
they'll-
ADU owns the primary residence.
Right.
Yeah, which
Would
you
that-
would initially,
But
then.
would that constrain the condominiumization of that?
Not necessarily.
in single- But it would be hard to find a lot large enough.
Large to do it.
Well,
Setbacks.
no,
there's
not
plenty of
necessarily.
third and
No,
half acre
no,
lots.
That's
Yeah,
not
you're
true.
right.
There-
absolutely,
Boy, that could change the whole dynamic.
we need to talk about the
But it would make it
regulations
a
and condominiumization.
non-ADU, and they would be in violation
Of what?
of our zoning code.
Why? If they
Be-
condoed it?
Because it has to be the owner that owns that.
No,
But if they then did what this lot did, that they sold it to someone individually as a separate household,
They would
no
be
longer an
They
ADU,
would be in violation of our ADU code.
why?
If you-
Because it has to be the owner.
It's no longer an ADU if it becomes a separate condo, private owner.
I see what you're saying.
Just like what happened here,
But-
except it happens again exponentially and all of a sudden.
But it
four
happens
lots.
purposefully. I mean, the
Right.
current one was not purposeful. It was,
Sure, I get it, but.
they couldn't split it because it would violate minimum lot size was the issue. And so the way to get around that was to kind of minimize it.
But the neighbor did it too.
It might be worth looking at, if you said there's ways to, if the board wants to look at rules to manage
There
condominium,
is.
whatever, condominiumization.
I know.
That might be a way to tackle on that language versus bringing back separate ordinances for different situations. I don't know if that's something we want to look into. I guess the question is how frequent do we think this is going to come up? Is it
Already
all
debated
bad, I guess
twice.
is the other
There's
question
a third
though.
one
Is
on
it all
Main Street,
bad?
too.
I mean, if people want more density
In the
No,
last
I-
couple months.
and want to do this, and are willing to split their lot up that way and take on the responsibility,
Yeah, but it's creating STRs.
well, that's where you can put some controls on it. And that's where that ordinance could say will allow this, because you can't outlaw it, but you can't, then that property could never be used as an STR, or you can never add an ADU if you want to put limitations on it that way.
You could change the STR ordinance where you couldn't put STRs in condos. I mean, that's one potential option.
Well, but then you run into the issue of the co-housing facility on Second Avenue.
Is it a R1 property?
No,
No, it's multifamily.
Right,
Yeah.
so,
So you would limit that then to R1.
R1 condos couldn't be.
would be, yeah, suggestion.
But then is that taking away a right of them to be able to have a short-term rental?
It's not a right to have a short-term rental.
I agree, no.
No, it's
How are we gonna enforce that?
Well, same as we force any STR, right?
So could this just be like a direction to staff to come up with a recommendation to limit STRs and condominium R1 lots?
Do you think we would like the PCDC to just look at condominiumized properties in general with respect to,
I mean, is it really, I guess it just depends. How much does PCDC have on their plate currently that we need them to do? I mean, last time we saw them, they had a good list of
I
stuff.
think they just talked about tiny homes as a extra task, and they seem to be able to do that, right?
Well, I think we said we didn't want them to dig into it. We wanted them to kind of give us an opinion and move on, and not go back and rehash and not provide language. We put some conditions on that.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like it's simple. It's not like a big thing they have to really do a whole lot of research on. And that's why I was thinking maybe staff could just recommend an adjustment to the STR language.
I have to figure, are STRs even worth it? Are we wasting our time trying to micromanage these things to the extent that, there's so few of them, we're not making any money off of it. We're spending so much time on it.
Well, it affects the quality of life of residents.
Just ban them.
Mhm.
That's what I mean. If we don't want them in our town and we don't want them, we're gonna just keep, going back and trying to close every loophole, just get rid of them and just say we're not allowing them.
Could be fine with that.
We're chasing loopholes.
Well, we
And
create the
It costs the town a
loopholes,
lot
so,
of money to
right.
do this. Every
Sure.
time we do something, we're paying
Mhm.
to do it. We have to remember that. Every ordinance costs money.
But if we create the loopholes that violate the intent of the process it created, I think it's the responsibility to follow up and to honor the commitment.
Well, I think we have to be careful, though. There's one STR on a property that found a way to use a state statute to condominiumize
Within a year, right?
within a year.
Mhm.
I don't know that that's the norm. I think you're gonna find people that will find ways around codes, no matter what you do. There's always gonna be some that break rules. And you can't catch all of them. You can't chase every one of them.
Well, perhaps
just
we
feel like there's
can
bigger
decide as a
fish to fry.
board.
Well, we can't decide here, so we have to bring it up there. And we have one more topic we need to get to tonight, so let's move on to that one.
Oh, one minute. Okay, any more discussion on this?
I agree with Trustee Drystat. I think the simplest thing to do would be to amend the STR ordinance to say no STRs on condoized properties. Now, those who have that existing right, you may not be able to affect them, but you would prevent somebody from doing it in the future. If their purpose in condoizing was to get around the STR ordinance, that would stop them. May not address the one you've got now, but it would.
We haven't heard
Limit
from
future
everybody,
use.
and we can't take a vote here, so we need to move on.
She asked for more comments, so I gave a comment.
I know, and I said we were moving on to the next one, so.
Yeah, okay, I made my comment.
Okay, the next thing is art zoning in the commercial downtown. PCDC has been looking at this since 2014 as a way to increase tenancy and diversify the downtown to take advantage of more modification to how industrial design and production is kind of moving into downtowns and revitalizing downtowns. So it's been on the table since then. There have been kind of debates about whether, how you could allow this into the downtown so that it doesn't detract from retail, that it doesn't detract from the pedestrian environment. The hope that when they started debating this, was that this would add 2 attractions in downtown. And so when they went through this ordinance and developed this language, they looked at, okay, what would, if we allow this as a component in the downtown, as a permitted use, how could we keep people coming to these facilities? And they said that there would be some public serving aspect to these, whether there would be something that's retail, or something like a lease program, or something that is an instructional program. We have had some of these in the downtown. We've had a wood shop that was creating surfing products, surfboards, and they would actually, most of the money they made was on the instructional program that they did, and it would bring people downtown that would spend time downtown. So we looked at kind of the businesses that were there. We also had a business come to town, and it was remanufacturing that opened in a space that is adjacent to Oscar Blues. And when they opened, we didn't know they were there, and we found out soon thereafter. So we expedited this process, not only for them, but for others that were had come in for consideration. So what we're looking at here is allowing a small-scale manufacturing that has limited off-site impacts and nuisances to adjacent neighbors, that is essentially a clean industry, to occupy buildings that are downtown as a permitted use, if they're small scale. And if they wanted to modify buildings, that would be a conditional use process. So the ordinance 1066 would put a new definition into the definition in the zoning code that expands kind of what we had previously as craft manufacturing. That was more artistic oriented. This is more manufacturing oriented, and allow that to exist in their downtown by providing that kind of regulating it so that there's not a lot of outdoor storage, and making it public serving to some degree. PCDC thought this would bring people still through to the downtown and potentially help out with property taxes in the downtown and tenancy in the commercial downtown.
Questions?
Yes, so I really like this idea, and I want to support it. My concern, though, is when I was reading under light industrial and what it means, you know, with our wastewater treatment plant and grease traps, for example, that have happened in other businesses. But food production could be a possibility, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and I'm just concerned that are we covered okay, that this is not going to produce something that could get into our sewer system? I mean, how does that get controlled so that we're not taxing our infrastructure?
So typically when there's a business that comes into downtown, we look at the loading to some degree. We look at, you know, what their wastewater profile will look like, and that's part of the business license. And if it's strong, we could do some, either some mitigation via side streaming or a pre-treatment program that would allow them to exist there. It wouldn't load our system.
So does that need perhaps to be worked into the language at all?
I don't think it does, because it's covered in other sections of the code.
And two other things too is that, you know, it is a conditional use. And, you know, if you're looking here in the zoning classifications, it would have to go through that process where that would be considered as part of the approval process. In light industrial, and the definition I changed, specifically excluded industries which, you know, had high solid waste production. And so, you know, before it was basically focused on non-polluting, which was not defined, and we kind of expanded it out to make it more restrictive.
Okay, so you feel that this is actually more restrictive than what it was before?
Yes.
So, just a question, had you seen this language prior?
Had I seen this language
Yeah.
prior? Yes, I
Okay.
wrote most of it.
Okay. I guess my concern is just enforceability of this, because so much of it is subjective. I mean, there's a lot of language in here that talks about it's generally kind of this, or it limits, or it should do. I didn't know if there was a way to kind of try to make it a little bit more objective, because when I think about artisan, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it does say small scale, but everybody's definition of small scale could mean different things. So like, some people might even call Green Goose small scale to some degree because it's local, you know? And so when I think about, we already have some of these too. We have the bamboo shop, we have the purse making shop. So how will they meet this the way it's currently written? Because they don't have necessarily a customer service space or a public viewing space always.
Oscar Blues would have qualified before, perhaps, right?
Well, exactly, and so I'm just trying to figure out, I like it, and I want to, but I also am like, we've had a lot of this going on, and I don't know how much it does bring people to town, quite honestly. I mean, I love those businesses, but I also I don't have a lot of understanding of how much it brings traffic.
Well, they tend to open first, and we find out afterwards.
Right.
Sure.
And so we could inherit lots of issues that we really, you know, didn't find out about.
Yeah.
I would say all of those businesses you named, including the two that are no longer, they all opened without a condition, you know, without any review with the staff of what they were going to be producing or putting down the.
Correct.
The waste.
We didn't have a business license review that, like we do now.
I know, but
So-
even like some of the producers of lotions and oil products, you know, even now, we don't know what exactly they're putting down the drain. I have this, I like the concept as well, but I do have some concerns about how to get ahead of it when businesses don't come see us before they open.
Well, they should be.
Well, I know, but what do you do then after the fact like this? We're putting it together a new code based on one business wanting to make it, you know, it's.
The PCDC looked at this in 2014, so they had this on their agenda for a long time. I wouldn't say it's because of one business.
No, it was not, you know, from my perspective, it was not written towards one business. It was written towards a new classification of businesses, permitting them in an acceptable way downtown. Getting back to the subjectivity issue, I mean, this hasn't really been done in a lot of contexts. We try to look at other places to try to see what we could pull together. And I don't know how numerically you could basically separate artisan manufacturing from an artisan studio or from other types of business classifications. What we try to do is put in as much stuff as possible, which could help narrow this world of what could qualify and just give indication to the staff, which will be responsible for interpreting the zoning classification. Always open to suggestion, but that's was kind of the idea behind it, is kind of limit the world. It's going to have to be subjective to some extent because it's hard to say this many square feet and these things always equals artisan manufacturing.
Yeah.
But was trying to kind of limit the world of potential qualifying businesses
Yeah.
by
I
putting
don't
some
think
language
it's
in there.
terribly far off,
Yeah.
actually. I'm thinking like you could say the manufacturing process is not automated, for example. I mean, you're talking about, you do have handmade in here,
Mhm.
but that, some people might think, well, I'm hand making it because I'm turning on the machine. You know? So I'm trying to just like,
That's
that,
good
to imply things that are customized or handmade without automation. Automation meaning, you know, you've got a production facility more or less. So I don't know.
Well-
That's just where I'm going and trying to figure out, is there a way to just strengthen it a bit and then try to make it a little more effective? I mean, I think about production too in terms of quantity. You're generally making smaller numbers of things when you're doing things customized and handmade. You can't generally make mass quantities. I don't know if there's a way to define that.
So PCDC struggled with this a lot. They looked at square footage. They looked at the number of employees. They looked at the number of offices outside of town. If they have just, if this is their only office or they have several different offices, that might not be considered small manufacturing for a town. What we came down to is with the built environment, what we're hoping here is to get tenancy and allow for this type of business and not to restrict it by size, but have the built environment do it. Because we don't have big buildings. And if they were going to come in and expand, there would be a conditional use. So we would have a lot of input into what that expansion would be. And so PCDC thought inherently that our built environment would have some control over that. We couldn't think about the breadth of businesses and come up with a square footage or a product number or a employee number, because that could vary substantially between different types of businesses.
I, like everyone else said, I like the idea, and it's fine. The concern I have is a little bit different than the rest is, you talk about light manufacturing, whether there's conditional or not. I don't know what the building was, what they were actually doing in the building next to us, building bikes, but anything that was required a chop saw, grinding, a big welder that you can just go buy and plug in a 110 outlet now, because technology has made it that way. Flint, can easily start a fire, and a lot of our old buildings don't have fire suppression, we don't have notification. It could be a concern on a health and a safety aspect there, depending what someone is doing. And of course, we don't know what they're doing now until they move in, and we find out afterwards. But
So-
it's just that kind of.
With any change in use, they will be required to get an inspection from fire and from the building officials, so they'll have to submit their building plan, and that will have to be reviewed for safety criteria. We did shut down one of their production systems at Reeb when they came in because they didn't have an ASTM number on it. It was a powder coater machine because JJ didn't feel that was safe. So we have been working with them to allow them to operate at a safe manner. But if this is passed, we will be asking them to bring everything up to date. Right now, we think they're operating at a safe level.
So Reeb is still operating there?
That is correct.
Yeah, I think that anybody that's occupying a building that's otherwise empty is bringing at least one person to town. And I think you expect any of these types of businesses start from somebody's got a hobby and then they're doing it in their garage, and then they need a bigger space. And how many spaces do we have in town to foster that kind of work in general, outside of the residential zone? I feel like the market takes care of a lot of the concerns, because eventually Oscar Blues makes beer somewhere that's more appropriate. Other businesses, most eventually go out of business. Some number of our artisan manufacturers have gotten a different interest after a few years, and or the market for their product goes away. So it seems like it's more about, do we want to police whether someone is selling a product on a 9 to 5 basis, weekdays or what have you, versus occupying the building, paying their rent, supporting the landlords here that have high property taxes. It mostly seems like a win, and also it's just not really that different from what the reality's been for ever since we were a carpet town.
Okay, well, we should keep going with just questions for right now, because we have a public hearing tonight.
Sure,
So we
yeah.
can deliberate then and decide where we want to go with it.
Do you agree, Paul?
Yes.
With what?
Okay, I just want to give everybody a chance to ask
Well,
any additional questions, because we do have the option, we can always continue it if you feel like it needs more time. So we always can do that tonight. I don't think there's a ton of urgency for this. So we'll get into discussion tonight.
Do
and
we have
see
a
where
public
we go.
hearing for passing the ordinance, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
But that's our opportunity to actually make changes that we might want to make once it gets to
I
us.
see,
But if
yeah.
we feel like this is really needs a lot more work, we could send it back to PCDC as another option. So we can see where we are then.
Or
but
just
I-
continue it for staff changes.
We generally try to workshop ordinances before we pass them.
For the same
forward.
day, right?
Yeah, we usually try to do it on first reading, but
Yeah.
we had other workshop items last
Yeah.
time that were
One
critical.
more
So
question.
this wasn't urgent, so we
Mhm.
decided we could continue.
question. Did the PCDC look at all at whether this could be allowed in commercial as well as commercial downtown district?
We already allow manufacturing in commercial. It's restricted. It's a conditional use. It's light. I think it's light manufacturing, and it's up to 10 people, which may be causing an issue currently.
So would that include a artisan manufacturer as it's described here?
Yeah.
They could do that as a manufacturing in a commercial zone district?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Do you anticipate any impact of differentiation between home business, artisan manufacturing versus?
Home businesses are very restricted. They wouldn't be allowed to do what is considered here. They can do some, arts and crafts, or some. There's a list of requirements for you to have a home business that the kind of level of manufacturing you could do it downtown wouldn't be the same.
No chainsaw.
Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I
think
just
it-
don't know that we're regulating those yet, then.
We have been.
There's lots of these things happening in residential.
Yeah.
We have a home business application in the license, and we have reviewed each one of those for compliance
That we know of.
that we know of.
Yeah, we've had at least 3 chainsaw art businesses in residential zones in the past.
Haircutting,
Yeah.
cabinet.
We-
making.
But I
we've-
mean, chainsaws,
we've-
yeah.
We've addressed the hair cutting. The cabinets were storage, I think.
Soaps.
Yeah. We've addressed the soaps. We looked at the output from those and the lotions. So, yes.
Chainsaw art probably wouldn't be allowed in either residential or in CD or anywhere besides. I mean, it's a serious, question. I mean, it's also funny, but it really is. It's been a big hit here.
think if there's a conditional use process, some of that might be considered if there's potential of igniting, you know, buildings that are attached, as in our commercial district, versus a building that might be separate in the commercial district.
Yeah.
That should all be considered, I think, through the conditional use review.
Yeah, so again, if you're moving into an existing building, it wouldn't be a conditional use. But for expanding that footprint, it would be. All of those uses would be reviewed by fire and have to be approved as meeting fire criteria.
Yeah. And I can't speculate as to exactly what the chainsaw manufacturer would be doing, but I think, yeah, but we can't say. You're right. I think anything involving a chainsaw might include nuisances such as odor, vibration, smoke, gas, dust, sound, soot, if you would, which would not make it qualify for arson manufacturing.
Unless they're doing it inside and they have a hood and they're under the hood and they have a, you know.
We have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, but I think they're going to have difficulty potentially. Yeah.
But you're clear that in all cases, there's going to be some form of inspection for fire safety and such.
Yes, unless a business is just moving in and it's the exact same use, it wouldn't trigger a review. At that point, fire would have already reviewed, and so would the building code.
Are we contemplating going around town and looking at current existing usage and start to regulate?
We've been. Yeah, when we have complaints, we're doing so. And again, this year we had an expanded business license form. So where we identified those as an issue, we looked into those. We're resolving our last ones now, and hopefully they'll all be resolved.
And fire has an independent authority to do inspections whenever they feel fit, which they usually do at the request of the town. So, yeah.
Any change in use, fire does do an inspection. If we ask, if we see something that is of concern, we let them know, and they'll trigger an inspection as well.
And they're concerned more than just fire, but like being able to
safety,
just
General safety,
bodily harm.
chemicals isn't a big issue with them.
that's
So,
right.
and they have administrative authority to issue their own warrants and do inspections, so it's not really a problem for them.
All right, so we'll have discussion later, see where we go. Anything else? We have a couple extra minutes that you needed to share before the meeting?
Right now, we do have the building inspector doing building inspections for a change in use. We do not have that as a required building a building permit, so they are not getting any fee for that. So we need to look at updating our fees to allow them to do that, I think. That'll be part of it. It's becoming more and more common as we look at all these businesses that are changing use to say, oh, we need to get out there and look at what's there. We have code compliance going out, and fire charges for it now. Any change in use, they just instituted that this year, probably about 2 weeks ago.
What are they charging?
They're charging, I think it's like $80. It's not much. Yeah.
So we do a fee schedule now by resolution, and I think we put in there we would review it annually, right? So is that just going to be like a beginning of every year kind of process?
I think January.
In the budget process, okay, good.
Should let them know we have an opening for complaints.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I did not let you know, but Ian Greer has decided to move on. Unfortunately, it was, everybody that he interacted with seemed to think he was a very sane person and a very, very good civil, sane, civil, and he had great customer service. So we're starting our process to look for another one. And in the meantime, we're likely going to have Charles Abbott and Associates fill in during that process. But we would like to hire a code compliance officer to replace Ian.
What's the salary range? I have somebody in mind.
It's posted right now on the website.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right, got a little extra time? Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
You all right? Need help?
Sure.
Every step right?
Just interested.
Your stuff right?
Oh,
Mayor did that too.
Go ahead.
I'm,